Thank you for coming out. Hope you are well breakfasted and coffeeed. It's our pleasure to have you here. Our speakers today are Imam Abdullah Antepli, who is the Chief Representative for Muslim Affairs at America's finest university, Duke University. A senior fellow at the Shalom Hartman Institute and co-founder of the Muslim Leadership Institute. And Jeffrey Goldberg, who is editor-in-chief of The Atlantic and signs my checks, so I'm a big fan of his. My name is David Graham. I'm a staff writer at The Atlantic.
And a graduate of Duke University.
You probably guessed that. I think a good place to start off, Abdullah, you've got a very interesting personal journey to this area of Jewish-Muslim relations. Could you just narrate that journey for us a little bit?
Absolutely. Good morning, everybody. It's wonderful to have you here, all caffeinated and ready for another wonderful day. It's been a great experience. Ideas Festival is almost like Ideas Feast. This is my last day here, and I'm already grieving for departing. Looking forward to continuing the conversation that has started over here. If we're going to talk about Jewish-Muslim relations, and if we are really serious and sincere about this, we have to really start acknowledging that Jews and Muslims are not doing well. We are not doing well. Jews and Muslims globally very polarized, and increasingly more so in the last couple of decades. And the kind of bias, hate, prejudice vis-a-vis each other has been going out of control in some parts of our respected communities, including the United States. I personally am subject of this 20th century deterioration of Jewish-Muslim relations. I always consider myself or call myself a recovering anti-Semite. I say recovering because if you are exposed to hate early on, and if hate got into your system in brain tissues and DNAs so early in your life, it takes a lifelong struggle to get that poison out of your system. The first book I read, I grew up in the southeastern part of Turkey, and they're not religious. I emphasize this. Secular, ultra-nationalist, chauvinistic education that I have received in my secular household. The first book I read about Jews and Judaism at the age of 12 was the children's version of the Protocols of Elders of Zion. Children's version. And the second book was Henry Ford's International Jew. And the third book was Mein Kampf. So before age 15, something which was written in Russian, English, and German was translated and given to me free in that age. And inevitably, I developed this incredible bias, hate against Jews, Judaism. I spent a number of years thinking that there is something irredeemably evil, irredeemably harmful about this religion and its followers. Thank God, God is God of mercy and compassion. What saved me was studying Islam, studying my religion, studying and getting exposed to mainstream Islamic theology. And then I couldn't reconcile the kind of Islam that I was falling in love with and the kind of hate that I have swallowed before. And thankfully, I met many wonderful Jews later in my life, which allowed me to take the nearest exit and drive in the opposite direction as fast as I can. And I would like to use my own recovery as a motivation factor to see if Jews and Muslims, we can do better. In many ways, Christians and Jews in the previous century, they delivered incredible gift to God. In the Exodus, I think that God says to Moses, tell children of Israel to collect me gifts. The Christian-Jewish reconciliation in the 20th century was an incredible gift to God. And in the 21st century, I'm hoping and praying we can deliver a similar gift to God in the form of reconciliation between Jews and Muslims, inshallah.
One of the ideas that we've talked about in the past is the importance for American Muslims in particular of building bridges to other groups that have been at times sort of outside the American tent or still maybe outside the American tent, whether that's African Americans or Jews or Mormons or other groups. How did you come to that realization and that idea?
If there is a voice from Sinai expecting a similar kind of gift, and if this is a moral obligation, which I believe it is, American Jews and American Muslims in this responsibility, we have a greater moral obligation to show the world what would a 21st century reconciled, healthier, a little bit more sophisticated, and nuanced Jewish-Muslim relations would look like. Because there are things possible in America, in North America, between Jews and Muslims that are not possible anywhere else. Let's not kid ourselves. Jews and Muslims in the Middle East, they are not locking arms and singing Hina matuvul manayim, Shevat Achim Gam Yachat. And Jews and Muslims in France and England, they are not singing Ozer Shalom Bimruma, Hu Yazo Shalom Aleinu. Things are tense, and many boats have sailed. Many boats have sailed that sometimes they cannot even be in the same room. They cannot even talk. They cannot even have a conversation because violence, terror, hate, racism, there is so much to blame for. I'm not going to go there. But here in America, despite Israeli-Palestinian conflict, despite all the problems, I'm not naive. I've spent 20 years of my life going in and out of Israel, working in the Palestinian refugee camps, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in West Bank. I know what divides us. They are real issues. But despite all these mountainous problems, here in North America, because of this beautiful country, because of the kind of context that we are in, and because of the Jewish and the Muslim communities, two very similar, very complementary faith minority communities in the United States, the ships have not sailed yet. But unfortunately, if we continue to allow importing division, polarization, and hate as Jews and Muslims in North America, if we keep importing despair from Middle East to North America, and if we keep seeing each other through the prism of political conflict in the Middle East, I think it would be a huge disservice to this country first, and the kind of potential partnership and alliances that we can build in North America. I hope before it's too late, before those. That's why I think I say it with a sincere sense of urgency that Jews and Muslims must do better.
Jeff, I saw you nodding along.
I was just singing Hine Matov to myself. Well,
my Hebrew accent is better than him.
Yeah. I don't think so. I don't actually think so, but we're all right.
There'll be a competition outside after this.
Right. We're gonna. No. Your question is an interesting one, and we've talked about this before about the way the Middle East conflict divides two communities in America that should actually be marching hand in hand, even theologically. I mean, if you think about it from a Jewish theological perspective, it's a lot easier for Judaism as a faith system to walk together with Islam, pure monotheism, as opposed to variations on Christianity, which don't actually conform to that view. Obviously, on a political, social level, it's easy. It should be easier than it is to walk together. There's again something that we've talked about many times. The Jewish story in America. We're just further down the road of the same story than the Muslim American community is today, even in terms of the controversies of being a Muslim in America today. If you remember in the 20s and 30s, Jews were considered by the majority of Americans as an alien and possibly dangerous presence. In 1926, when immigration was shut off, when there was a travel ban imposed on Jews, it was the same fear of the other that was causing that. And then on through the story, Muslims are about 2 generations behind Jews, in good ways and bad ways. You would argue, I don't want to put words in your mouth, and you can make this argument because I find it totally fascinating, that you're looking at the Jewish community as a role model and also as a warning. The warning comes in terms of assimilation and the degradation or decomposition of a faith community. The good parts of it are the same. The thing the bad are good. The assimilation, the ability, the willingness of Americans over time to accept Jews as full Americans is something that the Muslim community wants to achieve. I mean, it's a fascinating thing. And again, where I differ with Abdullah is that I don't think you can just park the Middle East conflict all the way to the side and act as if it's not there. You have to grapple with it, and by grappling with it in a constructive way, maybe you don't actually just neutralize it. You actually turn the North American Jewish and Muslim communities into a positive force for reconciliation in the Middle East. That sounds a little bit hopeful.
Absolutely.
But
so there are like 7 things I want to dig into there. Let's start with maybe the first one, do you think that American Muslims are on the same road as American Jews, or is it a parallel and similar road?
Absolutely, absolutely. In terms of Jewish experience, transforming themselves from a despised, hated minority of 1920s and 30s into a beloved minority, where they were in 1920s and 30s, it's very, very similar. There are striking similarities in terms of bias, external hate and exclusion, but also internal struggle. How are we going to hold this tradition, and how are we going to bring ourselves to become a mainstream, and how are we going to negotiate becoming a mainstream? What needs to be kept, what needs to be changed? And there is no other religious community than the Jewish community, very similar to our theology, our tradition, our judicial, like normative legal thinking in our tradition. In many ways, it's absolutely an incredible attraction, the kind of success story that the Jewish community was able to transform itself from a despised minority into a beloved minority, but it's also an incredible warning as well. I will give you one example. Everybody knows the Pew search results about the American Jewish community, right? Day after that research came out about the American Jewish community, 9 voice messages in my office at Duke University, Muslims around the country calling me and basically saying they are horrified. They are horrified by the interfaith marriage rate, assimilation rate, unaffiliated rate, etc. The Muslim community is calling me, in all honesty, saying, Imam Abdullah, you seem to know something about Judaism and Jews. Come and tell us how we will achieve what they achieve but will not pay the same price. How we are not going to end up in the same place. It's very interesting. So,
and what's the answer?
Well,
small question.
Exactly. There is no way Americans' melting pot and assimilation will do the same impact on the Muslim community as well. But I hope and I pray the Muslim community will learn and humble themselves and transfer the experience and the collective wisdom of the Jewish community. I hope we will negotiate better.
There's the fascinating irony here in the political context is that while many Americans believe that the main problem or threat, or however you want to frame it, of the American Muslim community is radicalization and therefore terrorism, and I'm not discounting the fact that young Muslim Americans every so often become radicalized and do very dangerous things. I'm not going to downplay that. But within the Muslim community, the fear is less of radicalization, which doesn't happen very often, and the fear is actually assimilation.
Which does happen a lot.
Which does happen a lot, and there's a discourse in this country, obviously located now even in the White House, about fear of the Muslim other, that the Muslim is unassimilable. And the truth is that the Muslims themselves fear that assimilation is all too real a threat. So we're having a dialogue in America about the Muslim community that has no bearing on the reality of the Muslim American experience.
Every mid-August at Duke University, I welcome a new class of freshmen. And in the 10 years that I'm there, we tripled the number of Muslims. It's a common pattern. Muslims are going to be where the Jewish community is in top 100 universities in 5 to 10 years. It'll be about 10% of the student undergraduate body. When parents basically give their daughters and sons into Duke University, they come to me and says, Imam, make sure he or she will go to the Friday prayers, will not eat pork, fall in love with a Muslim boy or girl, and will go to medical school. These are the concerns. These are the concerns. This is as a religious leader, my halachic responsibility is to make sure they will fall in love with their fellow Muslims, and then they will not eat pork, come to Friday prayers, and go to medical school. This is what keeps Muslim American parents up night. But I want to go back very quickly, David. Very important clarification that I need to make. I hope I didn't suggest that Jews and Muslims in America should park, ignore, suspend their loyalties to Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or should somehow create a silo. I hope I didn't suggest that, because it's not possible. It's simply not possible, and it would be so unfair to the deep loyalties of these communities, their connection, deep attachment to that part of the world. But I still believe, and that's what MLI program is all about, can Jews and Muslims in America meet each other where they are? Overwhelming majority of the Jews in North America, they consider themselves as, I hate these labels, but for the lack of a better term, Zionist, pro-Israeli, from a very different and diverse and spectrum way. Overwhelming majority. An overwhelming majority of my community, including myself, are pro-Palestinian. We grew up being in solidarity with our Palestinian brothers and sisters there. Despite this breakdown, it is, to me, pathetic. And it's so sad if Jews and Muslims in America, they are seeing themselves as the foot soldiers for a proxy war in the Middle East. And they have nothing to tell each other than the talking points of this political conflict in each side of the aisle. Despite this, without compromising and divorcing ourselves from that attachment and loyalty, I believe our American identity, our place in North America, in the world of rising anti-Muslim bigotry and anti-Semitism, and the kind of bigotry in general, I think we still can and should and must be able to be in relationship, deepen our relationship, and be able to say to each other more than just cheap political talking points.
Actually, it might be helpful if you back up just a little bit and give a brief overview of what MLI is and how it came about.
MLI stands for Muslim Leadership Initiative. It's based at Shalom Hartman Institute in Jerusalem. It's one of the most dynamic, modern Orthodox or conservative religious think tank where Judaism as religion, Jews as people, Zionism as a form of nationalism, and Israel as a state is being taught to thousands of rabbis and Jewish lay leaders in such an honest, critical, and a diverse way, under the same roof, far right and far left, and anybody and everybody in between. It's a very incredible institution. There are not many places I have met in the areas of religious education. And then about 10 years ago, they became so confident that they started teaching the same exact curriculum to a group of Christian leaders, mostly Protestant clergy. When I saw this, because in my community, I am trying to convince my Muslim community that there is a way in which we don't have to agree everything, but we should understand where the American Jewish community is coming from. We should be able to at least have a meaningful conversation. There is almost no common respectful language that we can communicate. I was shopping and looking for an institution who will welcome me and my community into their internal conversations and just teach us how they see the world. How does map appears in their mirror? And when I saw this, I immediately reached out to the leadership and said, would you consider teaching the same exact curriculum that you're teaching to the Jews and the Christians to a group of Muslim Americans who would love to benefit from this education? And the president of the Shalom Hartman was falling out of his chair. He thought I was smoking something. And he said, no Muslims will come to an Israeli Zionist organization and will try to learn the Jewish worldview or Zionism from themselves. I said, if I bring you really credible people who have standing in the mainstream American Muslim community, would you teach this education? And the rest is an incredible 5 years journey. So far, about 100 American Muslim leaders have gone through this program. Not only the program has become an incredibly successful impact for these participants to understand the kind of context that the Jewish community, the global Jewish psychological makeup, but also Shalom Hartman's credibility and that education engagement created incredible amount of goodwill in the Jewish community. Incredible amount of goodwill that 100+ young emerging American Muslim leaders spending 13 months of their time. It's a 13-month fellowship. We go for 2 weeks to Shalom Hartman, study their curriculum, come back, a lot of webinars and seminars in between, and then the same cohort of 25 people go back again for another 2 weeks for a very rigorous study. Many of these participants, their knowledge of Judaism, Tanakh, Halakha, and Talmud is, they can really serve as an interim rabbi on any Hillel campus, and then they graduate from the program. It created so much goodwill of many people that I see many of the Jewish community would like to do the same. Seeing dozens of Muslims are trying to understand me in my own terms, how do I understand Islam and Muslims in their own terms as well?
Right. I mean, does there need to be some sort of reverse that is teaching Hadith and Sunnah? I mean, what?
Well, this is one of the problems. Is that it's almost impossible right now to think of Al-Azhar in Cairo hosting a group of Jewish leaders for a 2-week, 3-week seminar on Islam. It's a one-directional issue at the moment. Maybe there's something in Jerusalem that could do it, but this program is actually, it's almost unbelievable in the context of the conflict, in the context of modern day Jerusalem. I mean, Jerusalem is where you learn that the monotheistic faith, that serious believers in the monotheistic faith are in ecclesiastical competition in a kind of way.
A deadlock.
No, and it's a deadlock. And Jerusalem, I mean, the physical architecture of the place, the Dome of the Rock was built as a response to the dome of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and it was made bigger and golden as a sort of a reproach. And obviously within the framework of the context, it becomes the conflict itself in Jerusalem becomes religiousized. And so when you walk into Hartman, I've been to this program. You actually have it's a courtyard with shade trees, and you have Israeli army officers learning the ethics of war according to the Talmud. Christian ministers sitting with rabbis learning, and these semi-befuddled Muslims, can't believe quite where they are. They get used to it after a while, but they're having this otherworldly experience of being essentially in a yeshiva in the middle of Jerusalem, and it's someone who covers Jerusalem, has lived there and written about this conflict for 30 years. I think it's the only place where you actually see in the same space Christians, Muslims, and Jews actually arguing their faiths and learning each other's faiths. And if it could be replicated, we'd be in a better place.
I think it would be fair to say that MLI has not been met without some controversial reactions within the Muslim community. Is that right?
Well, that's an understatement. That's absolutely an understatement. I knew all well this could be controversial. This could upset a lot of people in my community, but it's not uniquely Muslim community per se. I receive a lot of criticism and attack, social media lynching campaigns, mostly from activist communities like BDS, and that bloc is not entirely Muslim. There are so many Jews primarily who lead the intellectual and even financial zeal of that background. But yes, MLI has been incredibly controversial for a number of reasons. Like one of the factual reasons, which is not ideological, a week after we made the program public, we did the first cohort basically under the radar. We just was experimenting this. And the week after we made the program public, the Gaza war started. Thank you, God. Like what an interesting timing. And most Muslims and most pro-Palestinian activists, they heard about the MLI program in the context of Gaza war. And that community follows Gaza war or any conflict in the Middle East very different than many mainstream Americans. There's an overemphasis and focus on the kind of civilian tragedies. They were watching women and children being killed. And then in the context of that, they heard a group of Muslims are going to Israel to schmooze with the Zionists. That emotional reaction is quite understandable, and it died down over time. But there is still a sustained anger and frustration and opposition to the program on the intellectual and ideological grounds, in principle, mostly coming from the boycott, divestment, and sanctions community, because going and engaging with Israeli institutions breaks academic and cultural boycott, and therefore we are blamed for violating that growing in their own perception movement. And it's been received. I became, as the founder and the co-director of the program, an incredible amount of anger and frustration, from death threats to a lot of anger. But I think in the 4 years, a lot of the people in my community were able to understand, even if they disagree, they were able to understand the value of this kind of honest, authentic educational engagement programs.
So you talked about the importance of embracing the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in these conversations. How essential do both of you think that conflict is to American Muslim-Jewish relations? How central is it at this point?
It's very essential. It's very essential. You may not start talking about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, but if you don't aim, as Jews and Muslims, if you don't from the beginning, your goal is not to bring your relationship and friendship to a level of sophistication and health so that you can actually talk about Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you are basically wasting your time. In the post-election, there was an incredible Jewish-Muslim solidarity. Jews are going to the airports and getting arrested for Muslims. Muslims are repairing, vandalized the Jewish cemeteries. It's all nice. But no Jewish-Muslim relationship attempt, if it's not going to survive the next Gaza war, it's a waste of time, in all honesty. We have to really, in the words of Einstein, to me, he's one of the greatest rabbis of the 20th century. What we have been doing so far, there are two types of...
I like your Jewish pronunciation of Einstein, by the way. I really do. I really do.
There are two types of ongoing Muslim-Jewish conversations in North America. One, a group of Jews and well-meaning Muslims come together and they completely ignore, intentionally and deliberately don't talk about Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
These are those horrible, endless interfaith Seders,
exactly,
right? Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They talk about hummus, kosher chicken, halal chicken, and davening Amidah, praying Maghrib together. Like, it's all nice. But we have seen over and over the decades, this doesn't have enough teeth and strength to prevent the kind of increasing polarization, increasing anti-Semitism in the Muslim community, increasing Islamophobia and anti-Muslim bigotry in the Jewish community. If you look, both communities are becoming more vulnerable, and more hearts and minds are poisoned by hate vis-a-vis each other. It's not doing so. The second type of conversation is, they come and all they talk about is Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Everybody comes with the self-serving facts, United Nations resolution this, and they start throwing facts to one another. So far, what we did in the last 50 years is these two types of conversations, and this is where we are. And if we keep doing this and expecting a different result, in the words of Rabbi Einstein, we are insane. We have to do something differently. We have to go beyond the shallow kumbaya singing sessions, and we have to go beyond the shouting matches and political debates, which nobody convince each other. There should be a middle path.
So Jeff, you spent time in, you hung out at the Haqqaniya Madrasa in Pakistan, where it seems like this conflict ought to be the furthest thing away, and yet, as I recall your story, they're obsessed with the Jews. They're obsessed with Zionism, right?
No, this is all lovely, everything that you say, and we're friends, and I'm a big supporter of what you do, but this is sometimes I fear that it's a drop in the ocean. I lived in a madrasa in Pakistan, and you would think they'd have other things to think about other than Jews, but mainly what they think about is Jews, and in a cosmological sense, the Jew as the devil, and I'm not going to say that this madrasa is representative of all of Islam, but
it's very common.
But the problem is, so the problem is, yes, the interfaith Seder where you sit around and talk about hummus can be debilitatingly, just whatever. I can't do it anymore.
It makes you nauseous.
Can't do it anymore. And the opposite of that, which is the sort of the arid, sterile, let's debate the Israeli-Arab conflict in the way it's been debated for 80 to 100 years, doesn't get anyone anywhere. But we have to actually dive deeper into why that doesn't get anywhere. And look, no one should be under the impression that the MLI program that he invented turns Muslims into Zionists. That one of the points of this, and I just want to stress this on your behalf, one of the points of this is they only take pro-Palestinian activists, people in the Muslim community who are not, as our friend Waj says, yogurt Muslims. The yogurt Muslim is the equivalent of the Jew who supports the BDS movement or whatever.
I wouldn't accept anybody to the program if he or she is not sufficiently pro-Palestinian.
Right, but
how do you measure that?
How do you measure?
Imams have their own ways.
Yeah. But the opposite problem is that one of the root causes, if not the root cause, of a 100-year war between Arab and Jew or Muslim and Jew over the Holy Land is the inability of most Muslims across this period to acknowledge that Jews are an indigenous people of their ancestral homeland, and like every other group of people around the world, have a right to a nation state of their own in their ancestral homeland. And so, one of the reasons those dialogue groups are so arid and sterile and useless is because across broad swaths of the Muslim community, not just in America but in the world, you don't have to accept it, but you have to acknowledge that this is not, as the PLO charter would have it, much less the Hamas charter, this is not a European colonialist movement that came to the Middle East and stole Arab land. This is a group of people who never left, for one thing, and who come from this place and came from it before Islam ever even existed. And so, there's only so much right now that a program like this can do. It is a drop in the bucket. Drops in the bucket are better than no drops at all. But you know, the dialogue is not advanced across a broad swath of the Muslim world.
You are absolutely right that very common Muslim stubbornness of not really going beyond the Zionism and Israel born out of Auschwitz. You're absolutely right that there is almost no sense of acknowledgement in many different parts of the Muslim world, whether the Zionism as a nationalism or ideology or Israel as a concept could be born out of Sinai.
Right.
That something happened between Sinai and Auschwitz, that it's not entirely Judeo-Christian, Western colonial land grab. That's absolutely right. But it's not entirely the fault of my community. I don't think they have been given enough opportunities to, that's why MLI works. That's why Hartman Torah is incredibly profound. Even if you don't agree, you see that it's more than just colonial land grab. That there is a historical, biblical, scriptural, and spiritual longing to that part of the world, that there's an endowed sanctity, endowed sacred values to this form of nationalism. And you don't have to agree, but you see it. And therefore, you react differently. And I don't think the Jewish community, by and large, have done a very good job in showing that side of the story.
Oh, I'll do that critique next. Don't worry. Yeah, yeah. We can do that.
Look,
I can do that all day.
My community's responsibility and challenge is to see Israel and Zionism and American Jewish community's loyalty in a different light. Your community's, I think, challenge and homework is not to confine the 1.6 billion people and the 1,400 years of history through the lenses of security and terrorism,
right.
And also see the kind of consequences of that homecoming,
right.
which I grew to see, appreciate, and love. The consequences of that, the legitimate desire for a sovereign nation, right. On the other side of the aisle.
2 points on that. Yes, absolutely. And that has been a flaw of the Zionist movement and a flaw of different Israeli governments of not act. Look, what is the nature of the nature of tragedy is not right versus wrong. It's right versus right. Both sides have a narrative that is justifiable morally and historically and even theologically. And so you're absolutely right on that. The other point, and this is why what he's doing is a revolution in a kind of way. And it's a pro-Palestinian revolution in the following sense. For 80 or 100 years, Arab nationalists and then Palestinian nationalists have made the same arguments and have used the same tactics to contain and ultimately defeat the Zionist entity. It hasn't worked. The Palestinian liberation movement is the least successful liberation movement of the past 100 years. They haven't gotten haven't gotten anything like what they want, what they say they want. And so the argument for programs like this is actually a practical one, which is if you've been doing the same thing and it hasn't worked for hundreds, let's find something different. One of the key flaws of the Palestinian national movement is that they don't have a true understanding of the nature of their enemy, which is that, it's easy to say European colonialists, a strong wind will blow them away. It's not going to happen. It's not going to happen.
It didn't happen.
And so finding new tactics. I'm putting this in zero-sum, almost militant language rather than the language of peace, hope, love, and reconciliation, because I'm not an imam. Though I think I'd be a pretty good imam. I don't know.
I don't know.
He works for me. I have to go. Yeah, whatever you say. Yeah, you're a great imam. Yeah. Go ahead, imam.
He's one of my rabbis.
Yeah. The point is that there are practical reasons for the Palestinian national movement to approach its problem differently, coming out of the analysis or the observation that all the things that we've been doing haven't worked. Yeah. So let's think of something new.
Well, so what's this got to do with us, right? We're here in the U.S. We have populations. We're here in the U.S. We have you have evidence, anecdotal and occasionally quantitative, that for both Muslim Americans and Jewish Americans, there's a little bit more distance from the old country and from this conflict. There's a little bit more of a detached view. Why do we have to worry about these things now? Can't we just look at a new generation and wall that off?
It's another thing that we've been doing for the last 40 years. Again, David, that didn't happen. The pro-Palestinian loyalty in the Muslim community didn't go anywhere. and the loyalty, support, even when they are angry, that attachment of the American Jewish community to Israel, that didn't happen. I will speak for my community. The reason also why I initiated this program, we want to mainstream Islam and Muslims in America. Our reality in the United States as Muslim Americans, about 3-4 million people, we are one of the most successful recent integrated American faith minority. But because of 9/11 and everything happened since then, our perception is not such. We are not mainstream yet. If we are going to be mainstream in the United States, one of the main obstacles is our ability to engage with the American Jewish community or American mainstream in general, vis-a-vis Israel, vis-a-vis Zionism. And if we don't try to see the nuances, and if we allow in certain corners anti-Semitism in the form of anti-Zionism and anti-Israeli sentiments masked by this, but if we keep allowing that into our DNAs in these formative years of our community, we will never be mainstream. We will never be accepted by mainstream American society, and we will never be fully understood by our fellow Americans. This is not the only issue, but one of the main issues for us. And in many ways, if there is any hope for the future, I think, as I said, if we can model and exemplify certain relationships and conversations, even if we cannot export hope and solution to the Middle East, I think we can reverse that negative energy flow in one way or another.
The alliance between American Muslims and American Jews should be a natural alliance. And though Jews have achieved a level of integration and assimilation and success that Muslims have not, simply by virtue of arriving earlier in larger numbers, the Jewish position, as we've learned over the past year and a half, is not as secure as some people might have thought, including me, 2 or 3 years ago. The creeping a creeping discourse, anti-Semitic discourse, into at least the margins of American political life has been shocking to some people. When you're a minority in a country made up of a lot of different minorities and some majority communities, you need allies. And so it's not just, there's an obvious argument on the Muslim side to latch on to the American Jewish community and its political power and its well-established civil rights organizations, and to ride that toward the mainstream. And of course, as you say, there's one price of admission is not to be anti-Semitic and not to call for the extermination of the state of Israel. But put that aside. And
you can't build an alliance that way, really?
No, it's going to be hard to have. It's really hard to have an alliance on those points. But on the other hand, it's not as if there are no practical benefits for the American Jewish community, which is a community that's been obviously oriented towards civil liberties and has supported civil liberties causes and civil rights causes, not only for selfless reasons, that's what the tradition says, but because the inclusion of other communities, of other marginalized communities, means that your own marginalized community becomes less marginalized. Mm-hmm. And so it is very important on the Jewish side of the fence to figure out ways to achieve this dialogue and this coalition with Muslim Americans. And again, the Jewish experience of the 20s and 30s is not the Jewish experience of today. The alienation that you might feel when you hear politicians talk about your community and your faith is an experience that my grandparents understood really well.
In other words, what's happening in the Middle East are not far realities, making no impact here in America. It's very close realities. Like many of us treat each other, especially Jews and Muslims, through the lenses of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. One of the consequences will be, if we keep unfortunately not doing what we need to do, if we keep doing the same thing and allow this polarization to take place, the hate in halakha and in Sharia, hate first kills and destroys the bearer. It will destroy us. That's what I'm doing, all for selfish reasons. I want to defeat anti-Semitism in my community, mainly for selfish reasons, not because of its potential danger to the Jewish community. But if you allow hate in any form and shape, it will first eat up your ideals. It will rot your morals and ethics. You will become a community very politically driven. Your religiosity, your spirituality, your connection to your citizenship will be shaped by political ideologies, but not by the ethical moral teachings of your faith tradition. I think there's a similar danger vis-a-vis increasing anti-Muslim bigotry in the Jewish community. If you look, the organized Islamophobia industry, I'm not talking about people watching what's going on in the world and developing negative views of Islam. People intentionally and deliberately spending millions of dollars to cast culture of fear and suspicion on Islam and Muslims. There is a very significant increasing Jewish money, Jewish fingerprint, Jewish push in that.
This works both ways. Both communities in America right now have a problem of the native informant.
Yes.
The native informant is a Muslim community listens to Jewish people who are born Jewish at least, who made their business to be anti-Israel.
Yes.
And the Muslim community listens to that minority and says, aha, they are telling us the truth about Jews, the truth about Israel. The same thing happens in the Jewish community. You get speakers who are apostate Muslims or ex-Muslims or whatever they define themselves as, who come in and tell people, and this happens in churches too, tell people the things that they want to hear about Islam.
Yeah.
You know, if you're predisposed to think that Islam is an unvariegated community of extremists, there are people who have Muslim names who you can hire to come and tell you exactly what you feel and reinforce that. It works both directions, and it's an incredibly negative dynamic.
And it's very dangerous. It's very, very dangerous. It's dangerous that it will turn our younger generations into partisan, some group partisan sort of political activists. But more and more, a lot of young generation, what I see in the college campus, I'm a college chaplain for 15 years. Many Jews and Muslims on college age, they look at this zero-sum game of the leadership of the Jewish and the Muslim communities in North America, and they say, I'm not interested. I'm not interested. I'm not going to be part of this gray-haired kids game. I will live my life, and they check out. We will lose more people to apathy than this political partisanship.
So we should move on to questions, but one last thing. Let me offer you a provocative premise, and I'll see if you agree. In light of the things you're talking about and the pressures you alluded to that we're seeing on the American Jewish community, could it be that the rise of Donald Trump is the best thing to happen to Jewish-Muslim relations in America?
Yeah, absolutely.
I'm not ready to say absolutely, because it is a welcomed, quote-unquote, pain in our thigh. It creates an opportunity for Jews and Muslims to reconsider their litmus tests. It provides an opportunity for Jews and Muslims to reconsider singing a new song. As one of my favorite Psalms, I think it's Psalms 98, when God says to David, Shiru Adonai Shir Chadash, sing me now, sing new songs. And then part of the midrash of that commandment is, that means the old songs that you've been singing is messed up. If we see this Trump reality, this emerging common threat, as this voice, if it forces us to sing some new songs, if we can bring our communities to see each other in a different light, yes. But I see a lot of shortcuts attempts.
It's necessary but not sufficient.
Yeah, it's not sufficient. It can start a conversation, but you should build enough willpower, commitment, sincerity, sense of compromise and sacrifice that you should just continue.
So I would put it this way: Donald Trump. So you know how Iran, the looming threat of Iran, is bringing Israel and Sunni Arab states together. Donald Trump is the Iran of this. I'm using this on purpose, by the way, and I hope it's tweeted. Donald Trump is the Iran of this drama. He's taking people who are not natural allies and actually forcing them to say, maybe we have a common threat that's worth working on. It's a helpful stimulus. It's an accelerant, but it's not going to do it. It has to happen organically also.
I am an irredeemable optimist. I don't mean to be a rain into people's parade. But we have seen this with Oslo. When Oslo was massaging everybody here in North America, I have seen this desire of Jews and Muslims and attempts and etc. It all fell apart. Why it fell apart? Because we didn't seize the moment, capture that initial energy, and build deeper and sustainable relationships.
Well, we'd love to take a few questions. Right here, we'll bring some microphones around. If you could stand up, that would be wonderful.
Let's make sure one male, one female question.
All right.
Let's have the gender equality.
Also, one Muslim, one Jew. Which is going to be easier it's going to be easier on the Muslim side, by the way.
I do all the Gentile questions. We don't get any others. What is this?
No. This is a safe space for Muslims and Jews, David.
Or Christians, or of people of no faith.
Yeah, or of no faith. Yeah.
Abdullah, I applaud what you're doing.
Thank you.
There is a great lack of information in the U.S. about what is happening in the mosques. What are the leaders of the Muslim community doing to encourage the Muslim Americans to come out and speak if there is a fear of a terrorist, if something is brewing? Knowledge is power, and ignorance can lead to very poor decisions. There is a lack of transparency. There's a lack of information in the media. What can the Muslim leaders do to create more transparency, to come out in the media, to speak as to what they're doing and encouraging their people to do to avoid Islamophobia?
Wajahat and Jeff owes me $100 each. I predicted the first question.
Hold on.
It's amazing. It's amazing. A Muslim is beating a Jew in the bet.
I'll donate it to the MLI, all right? I'll donate it.
This is $1 million question. Yola, right?
No, it's a $100 question, all right? Don't try to play that game, all right?
Yoli, this is $1 million question, and it's a legitimate question. I am not dismissing your question, but it is the heart of the matter. If after 16 years of 9/11, Muslim community spending 80 to 90%, I'm on the board of 9 mosques. Our outreach budget is 60% average. If Muslim community for 16 years, all they do, sometimes at the expense of our well-being, we have other issues to deal with, but the organized leadership is doing everything they can, which is clearly not enough, to be the voice and face in this kind of environment, to be a resource where the majority of Americans can turn to and educate themselves, and etc. But if after 16 years of a lot of hard work, that's why MLI was important for me. I saw this coming in many ways, and I was able to convince a lot of Muslims as well. That means something is fundamentally wrong. Again, if we keep doing the same thing for the last 16 years, people will keep asking, where are the moderate Muslims? Why don't we hear them? And there are 2 possible answers to this question. Either there is an evil business happening in the name of Islam. There are evil organizations, terrorists, ISIS, Al-Qaeda, Hezbollah, Hamas, list is long, doing incredibly horrific things in the name of Islam. Bloodshed, beheading, horrific. And 99% of the victims of Islamic extremism and Muslim terror are Muslims themselves. It's killing more Muslims than anybody else. There are 2 answers to this question in light of this whole tragedy. Either Muslims at its best are apathetic, they don't care, or at its worst actually supporting or endorsing this bloodshed and horrific evil reality emerged in the last couple of decades. Or Muslims are doing everything they can and somehow you don't hear. Somehow your sources of information, your sources of whatever you are relying to see the world and try to analyze the world is so problematic in many different ways, intentionally, unintentionally, that you are not able to get access to that voice and face. I invite you to see the lack of common sense in the first possible answer. To think that 1.6 billion people, at its best, they don't care. At its worst, actually, they believe in this fire-breathing dragon interpretation of Islam. I invite you, this is exactly the kind of distorted propaganda that the Jewish community has suffered. Jews are eating Christian children's blood, or they killed God, etc. Like incredibly nonsensical fictions, but people kept repeating the same propaganda in the church and elsewhere that people made to believe these inconceivable stuff.
Can I also say one thing about this question and this general topic? When someone from the alt-right or a neo-Nazi or a white racist kills black people randomly on the street or shoots up a Sikh temple, nobody comes out and says, how come the white American community isn't condemning the actions of these whites? Yeah. And so sometimes I think an unfair burden is put on Muslim leaders to sort of instantly react and disavow people over whom they have no control and for whom they have no love, affection, or respect. That is, and the second piece of it is, as a journalist, I say this, there is plenty of dialogue in the American Muslim community about how to battle extremism and for if nothing else, for self-interest. And so the fact that people don't hear this and see this is actually a troubling thing.
And as a journalist, what responsibility do you think, how much of that is our fault?
you can cover things and people don't read them. No. I mean, I think it's written about. I don't think it's the dominant narrative. And I think if you're fighting a dominant narrative, people don't pay as much attention to it.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are so many statistics. If you look after 9/11, less than 10% of terrorism done by Muslims in America. At about 90+%, more than 80% of the terrorism is done by white supremacists. But if you look into the media coverage of these percentages, media covers 95% of that 10% and covers very little of that 90%. And media has a responsibility.
To be fair, saying after 9/11 it was this discounts 9/11, which was a seismic break in American history in which 3,000 people died at the hands of 19 Muslim terrorists.
Right.
So it's not illegitimate. I mean, this is a separate hot button issue if you want to go down this path. It's a separate hot button issue that people around the world, people living in London and Paris and New York, aren't necessarily prejudiced if they think to themselves, boy, Muslims seem to want to, at least some Muslims want to kill us because they see it in Orlando, they see it in Berlin. Right. The problem is all in the calibration of how to think about it. And this is not obviously to discount white terrorism.
But the question is, why am I not hearing a Muslim voice? Muslims should do a better job. That's why I'm here. Yesterday was my wedding anniversary. And I could have spent it with my sweetheart in Durham, North Carolina, but I missed no opportunity because mainstream media will not cover my voice.
By the way, yesterday was also my wedding anniversary, and I spent it with Abdullah.
Today is my birthday.
Today's his birthday.
Why there are no more journalists on New York Times, Atlantic? Why there are no more Muslim faces and voices in the mainstream media outlets? There are so many skilled, qualified people. I think it's important to push the American Muslim community to produce these public messaging. But also, Muslim community can do so much. If the non-Muslim brothers and sisters do not go one extra mile and see their responsibility in this communication failure of the 16 years, if you're going to keep expecting Muslim community to do everything they can, I will say everything that you want to hear until my face turns blue. But if you don't go one extra mile and try to see where I exist, where my voice exists, where my voices are covered, unfortunately, you will never hear me.
Another question.
Male.
A male.
Let him moderate.
If you could stand up, please.
Yeah. I'm an American Jew. I wanted to pose this question to Jeff, which is roughly the parallel question to the previous one that was asked to Abdullah, which is how do we within the Jewish community deal with our demons? We have parallel problems in our community. We're not free of Islamophobia and other, and an overly pleasant picture of what the Israeli situation really is. And even your comment that, about the depiction of Zionism as a European colonial plot, that's clearly not totally true, but it's also clearly not totally false.
Well, we're going to agree to disagree on that one.
Sure.
Okay.
And, I'm not a BDS advocate either. I'm just saying that I think there are overtones of having mixed one thing with another, and that we have to deal with those within our own community, which by and large, although many of us reach out to the Islamic community and have shown up when bad things have happened, the Jewish community in America, by and large, is oblivious to all of this.
Well,
so how do we reach out more, not to the Islamic community, that we should do, but how do we reach out within our own community to change the internal thinking?
Well, I think that, you're more of an expert on the Jewish community at this point than I am. And no, Abdullah meets with everybody and talks to everybody, and you should answer this. I actually think that the Jewish community is more diverse than you say. I think that AIPAC and organizations like AIPAC have a lot of weight, but I think it's actually the discourse has diversified, and I think Abdullah knows that among your best allies on this stuff is the Reform Jewish movement, the Conservative Jewish movement too, the Reconstructionist movement. I think that it is more variegated than you might be portraying. But I would go back to this point I was making, which is that it is there are Jewish organizations that do the same thing that happens on the Muslim side, which is bring ex-Muslims, or however you want to define it,
or self-hating Muslims,
or self-hating Muslims, which is obviously a phenomenon on the Jewish side as well. Bring them to tell them what they want to hear about the conflict. But I think with the rise in the last 10 years of J Street and Americans for Peace Now and all this, I think that the Jewish community is more assimilated and more self-confident than the Muslim community. I think there is a wider span of opinion that you could hear. Am I wrong?
Thank you. I wouldn't call myself more expert about the Jewish community than you. I think you are being humble. But your noble invitation is very well heard. You know, I never miss a Yom Kippur worship service. Wherever I am, I find the nearest synagogue because I love that chest beating. I love that chest beating. I think that's something teaching to us. Nobody goes and beats the chest of the person next to you. You did this, you did that.
Except right now.
Everybody, everybody says, like, everybody says, what did I do wrong? Like, what can I do? I can't do anything about the external world. I think that individually and collectively, we should be asking more of these questions. Is me and my community contributing to hate? Am I allowing in my community hate go unbiased, unchallenged? And that's all I can do. Quite honestly, I tell everybody, why are you doing MLI? Why are you putting yourself in all sorts of danger? Why are you using your own social equity and become a questionable person in your own community? Because that's all I can do in my community to put some filters and obstacles towards hate. So at least it will be slow enough that my community's filters, ethics and morals, will catch on them. And the Jewish community, I think, ethically and morally obliged to do the same.
Love another question right over here.
It's all right. It's all right.
Okay. So my question is, when was the last time you've examined the teaching tools, starting with the stories that are being told starting in kindergarten? I asked that question from the point of view of having been 1964 in the first Head Start program. So it starts at the root. And so much hatred kind of subliminally is passed in the very stories that are being told like preschool. So as an action, can we all examine what we give our children to read and what stories we tell?
I think you addressed that, yeah.
And, I mean, short and long answer is absolutely yes. You know, I will never forget. My daughter, who's 16 now, when she was going to elementary school, we are Muslims, we don't eat pork. And we chewed everybody at her school's ears, make sure she is not going to eat pork. She ends up being on the lunch table with a bunch of Jewish girls and boys. But she came home one day and said, Baba, I understand we are Muslims, this is God's plan to us, we don't eat pork, but why can't Jonathan eat? Why can't Kim eat pork? And I caught myself in the middle of my own sentence. As I was trying to explain my 7-year-old daughter, instead of saying why this plan is a unique plan and a relationship type with our God, and it's perfectly okay if that plan is not relevant to other people, instead of talking about what's good about this, I was putting Jonathan and Kim down. I was somehow giving the impression that somehow God spent more time creating us than them. I was devaluing the humanity of these people. You're absolutely right. Most of the hate and bias happens not directly trashing the other people when you talk about yourself. Because if you stop talking about what's good about your plan, your religion, your identity, only by putting other people down, if you see the value of your faith.
Specifically about the books you present in school that children
Yes.
study and read. How much of that has anti-Semitism in it, anti-Muslim in it? Can there be a real conversation at the table with books that are being presented every single day to school children?
It can and it will.
Okay.
Yeah,
Looked at those books.
All right. Okay, you wanna go to
I do, yeah. I teach in the Sunday school myself.
one more?
I would love to grab one more quick question. Here we are. I've got to follow the scheme. Abdullah laid it down.
We're going to be around for a while. I would love to have, we're out of time. We just warmed up.
Not a question, but a comment to make. Several years ago, I was in Paris, part of a United Jewish Appeal visit, and I saw firsthand the situation in Paris where the Muslims have isolated themselves to the point that the French authorities were afraid to even go into the area. They wanted to rule themselves with Sharia, and they didn't want to have the government of France have any impact on them. Secondly, I'd like to make a comment to you.
about a question?
Secondly, another comment.
Yeah,
I'm old
but
enough to.
People want to ask questions.
When people have questions, yeah, if you could ask a question, that'd be wonderful. Otherwise, we'll be around.
Well, I'm
afterwards.
standing up. Can I finish what I'm started to say?
No.
Let's,
The audience is spoken.
There's a woman
Back here. Who are you pointing to?
That woman in
Please
In the
stay.
back.
I
Here we
would
are.
love to. I know the French scene quite well.
Hi, everyone. I'm part of the Basel Scholars Program. And I just want to comment on what the first person said. And one
If
of
we can
the-
stick to questions, I'm sorry. We're
Just a
running over.
question,
Just a
really
quick
quickly.
question, please.
Okay. Another reason why Muslim leaders fear speaking out to the public is because of fear. And that was something that no one else mentioned. They're afraid of being the next target of another hate crime. And that's also me. And for example, when I get out of school, I probably stay until school at 7 p.m. doing homework or something because I can't concentrate at home. When I get on the metro bus, I have to cover up my hijab with my hoodie. I'm afraid of someone coming up to me and, something bad happening. It's kind of like a natural instinct for me, like anyone else. And I think that's one of another main reason as to why Muslims fear of speaking out,
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you will find no better allies than the Jewish community, or to a certain extent, the Catholic community, who will understand your cry, your pain. It is absolutely shameful that anybody would be fearful of their basic safety and security, not because of anything they have done wrong, just because of who they are. I see this among my students. There are 5 students this year, they took off their hijab. They couldn't take it anymore. Because Duke is in North Carolina, in 20 miles, 30 miles out of our campus, you see church signs screaming hate and inviting violence against Muslims. But at the same time, as fearful, as painful as being a Muslim in America at this time, that should empathize us towards African Americans, LGBTQ community. We shouldn't only be crying to our own pain, own suffering, own alienation. That's one thing that I hope overwhelming majority of Muslims will applaud and uphold, that anti-Semitism should not be only Jewish problem. Islamophobia should not be only Muslim problem. Homophobia should not be only LGBTQ problem. We will only defeat this hate and bigotry on the rise in our society if we all see this as one big fight and fighting it together. Thank you.
On that note, thank you all very much. Thank you, Abdullah. Thank you, Jeff.